Catherine, once the proud star of a children's television show, finds herself ensnared in a world she cannot escape. The puppet-like Holly, an animatronic child-sized robot, exists only to fulfill Catherine's will. Through wires and radio waves, Catherine can make Holly walk, talk, and perform, an extension of her own desires, a mechanism to fill the hollow void of her career. Yet as the pressures of her existence intensify, Catherine begins to feel an oppressive, invisible force closing in. Holly, who is never meant to be more than a lifeless object, starts to speak to her. The robot, once an obedient tool, now seems to challenge Catherine's authority, questioning her every move. At first, Catherine dismisses it as madness, the result of exhaustion, the mental strain of an ill-fated pregnancy, and her collapsing personal life. Yet the sensation does not dissipate. It grows, a gnawing presence, like the feeling of 1,000 invisible eyes watching. Eddie, her coworker, the man that she has allowed into her life and her body, now becomes the source of conflict. Holly's strange jealousy of him, of everyone around Catherine, builds until it cannot be ignored. Is this the beginning of Catherine's madness, a spiral that threatens to pull her into the abyss of her own fractured mind? Or is it something more sinister at play, something that cannot be explained by mere delusion? Each moment feels like a tightening noose. The show that once brought her adoration now feels like a prison. The robot that once served her has become a grotesque reflection of her own inner turmoil, twisting the wires and signals between creator and creation until they are indistinguishable. Holly, the puppet, is no longer just a puppet. She is something else, something alive. But who is truly trapped in this house? Catherine, or the one who is never supposed to be real? Catherine's experience of hearing Holly's voice and seeing the robot act in ways she cannot control could be seen as manifestation of intense psychological stress. The pressures of her pregnancy, the complicated relationship with Eddie, and the demands of her job seem to push her to a breaking point. These symptoms, hallucinations, delusions, and paranoia could be a response to overwhelming stress, possibly linked to a psychotic episode. The stress of her personal life is so severe that her mind begins to blur the lines between reality and imagination. This is commonly seen in cases of stress-induced psychosis or schizophrenia. At its core, the story explores the theme of control. Who controls whom and what happens when control is lost? Catherine, as the creator of Holly, believes she has the authority over her robot. However, as Holly begins to show signs of autonomy, Catherine's control slips away, reflecting a deeper fear of losing control over her own life. Psychologists would likely interpret this as a struggle with self-identity. Catherine may be confronting her own sense of helplessness, not just in her work, but in her personal life as well. The robot's growing independence mirrors her growing realization that she cannot control her own circumstances or identity. Catherine's relationship with Holly could be viewed through Fisch's idea of self struggling against the other. Holly, as an autonomous robot, represents an other that begins to challenge Catherine's sense of control and identity. Initially, Holly is a creation, an object made to serve Catherine's desires. But as Holly gains more autonomy and becomes more alive, it ceases to be a mere object and becomes an existential other that challenges Catherine's understanding of herself. This shift mirrors Fisch's notion that the self cannot exist without the recognition of the other, but the other, when it becomes too powerful or too independent, poses a threat to the self's own existence. Both Fisch and Kant would be concerned with how the blurring of reality in Catherine's mind affects her sense of self. Fisch would see this as a problem of self-definition. Catherine, unable to reconcile the reality of Holly's growing autonomy with her own sense of identity, faces a crisis of selfhood. Kant, on the other hand, would focus on the failure of Catherine's rational agency. As her reality fractures, she becomes unable to act in accordance with moral law, and her autonomy is undermined. Both philosophers would argue that the crumbling of this distinction between self and other is a source of psychological and existential collapse. Drawing from Kant's critique of judgment, we can also see the story's theme of the uncanny. Kant argues that the uncanny arises when something familiar is perceived as strange or disturbing, challenging our sense of what is real. In Holly's house, Holly, the child-sized robot, initially appears as a harmless, controlled figure, but soon transforms into something unsettling, reflecting the uncanny as it blurs the lines between lifelike and lifeless. The uncanny evokes a discomfort because it's both familiar, like a doll or a child, and uncomfortable, a robot, an autonomous being. Foucault might view Catherine's increasing inability to control Holly as a loss of power and a collapse of the self-discipline she once exercised. The robot, once a mere object in her control, begins to embody a counterforce, challenging Catherine's own autonomy. This would be a powerful exploration of how technology, once created to serve, can begin to challenge or even overpower its creator. Foucault would also likely highlight the ways in which technology, here represented by Holly, can act as a form of surveillance. Holly's growing autonomy could be seen as a metaphor for how modern technologies like social media, artificial intelligence, or surveillance tools increasingly invade our private lives, reflecting the panopticon, the idea that we are always being watched. And we internalize this gaze, leading to a loss of individual agency. Donna Haraway's work on cyborg theory and the blurred boundaries between humans and machines would be directly relevant to the robot Holly's growing autonomy. Haraway's famous Cyborg Manifesto argues that the traditional boundaries between humans and machines are increasingly fluid, as we move into an era where technology is deeply intertwined with human identity. In Holly's house, Haraway would likely see Holly as a cyborg, not in the traditional sense of human-machine hybrids, but as an example of how even seemingly non-human machines like robots challenge the boundary between the organic and the mechanical. Holly's increasing independence and emotional complexity, particularly her jealousy, create a disruption in the idea of the human as a unique, separate entity. Haraway's theory would suggest that we are entering an age in which machines, or more accurately cyborgs, are not merely tools but active participants in identity construction. The fear of Catherine losing control over Holly could be seen as a reflection of anxieties around the loss of human uniqueness and the rise of autonomous technologies that blur the line between human and machine. Zizek, a contemporary philosopher well known for his work on psychoanalysis and the uncanny, would likely focus on the psychoanalytical aspects of Catherine's experience. For Zizek, the uncanny is often a concept tied to repressed desires and the return of the repressed, things that we cannot fully process but that resurface in disturbing forms. In Holly's house, the robot Holly could represent Catherine's repressed fears and unresolved anxieties about her own identity and future. As Holly becomes more autonomous and speaks to her, it could symbolize a revelation of her unconscious mind, confronting her with aspects of herself that she has been unwilling or unable to address. Her insecurities, her relationships, and her fears about motherhood. Zizek would likely argue that Holly is a manifestation of Catherine's own sense of alienation and lack of control, and her growing jealousy could be seen as a symbolic confrontation with her repressed desires and frustrations. The encounter between the real and the imaginary, the human and the machine, becomes a site for ideological conflict in which Catherine must face her own personal inadequacies. As the final scene plays out, we're left in a void between the synthetic warmth of Holly's mechanical embrace and the cold, silent abyss of Catherine's unraveling reality. What begins as a children's game turns into a grotesque dance of control, jealousy, and existential fear. It's a tale as haunting as it is simple. When we create what we can't fully understand, what do we lose in the process? A soul, a mind, or simply our grip on what we thought we knew? In the end, perhaps it's not just Holly who's trapped in the wires, but all of us, trapped in the stories we weave, unable to escape the confines of our own creation. Watch this video next.